The Whispers of Baker Street, a Sherlock Holmes adventure. My dear friend, gather round and lend me your ear, for I have a tale to tell that will set your imagination ablaze and your heart racing. It's a story of mystery, intrigue, and the brilliant mind of the one and only Sherlock Holmes. But before we delve into the depths of this extraordinary adventure, I must warn you, once you start listening, you won't be able to stop until the very last word has been spoken. Are you ready to embark on a journey through the foggy streets of Victorian London, where secrets lurk in every shadow and danger awaits around every corner? Then sit back, relax, and prepare to be transported to a world of deduction and daring. The Curious Case of the Midnight Caller. It was a dreary evening in March 1888 when I, Dr. John Watson, received an unexpected letter from my dear friend and former roommate, Sherlock Holmes. The missive, penned in his characteristic scrawl, beckoned me to 221B Baker Street with an urgency that piqued my curiosity. As I made my way through the fog-laden streets of London, I couldn't help but wonder what new mystery had captured the attention of the world's only consulting detective. Upon arriving at the familiar door, I was greeted by Mrs. Hudson, who ushered me upstairs with a knowing smile. "He's been in quite a state, Dr. Watson," she whispered conspiratorially. "Pacing and muttering to himself all day. I dare say you've arrived just in time." As I entered the cluttered sitting room, I found Holmes perched in his favorite armchair, his hawkish features illuminated by the flickering firelight. He glanced up at me, his gray eyes glinting with that familiar spark of excitement that always preceded a particularly intriguing case. "Ah, Watson," he exclaimed, leaping to his feet. "How good of you to come. We have a most singular client arriving shortly, and I find myself in need of your steady presence and keen observational skills." Before I could inquire further, a sharp rap at the door announced the arrival of our mysterious visitor. Holmes motioned for me to take a seat, and with a flourish, he threw open the door to reveal a tall, broad-shouldered man wrapped in a heavy cloak, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his brow. "Welcome, Your Majesty," Holmes said softly, bowing with a grace that startled me. "Please, do come in and make yourself comfortable. You are among friends here." As the cloaked figure stepped into the room and removed his hat, I found myself face to face with none other than Wilhelm Gottsreich Sigismund von Ormstein, the hereditary King of Bohemia. The monarch's piercing blue eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice a rich baritone tinged with a slight German accent, "I find myself in a most delicate situation, one that threatens not only my personal happiness, but the very stability of my kingdom. I have heard tales of your discretion and your unparalleled skills of deduction. I can only hope that you will be able to assist me in this matter of utmost urgency." Holmes gestured for the king to take a seat, his keen gaze never leaving the monarch's face. "Pray, Your Majesty, begin at the beginning. Leave out no detail, no matter how trivial it may seem. In matters such as these, it is often the smallest thread that, when pulled, unravels the entire tapestry of mystery." As the king began to speak, I felt a shiver of anticipation run down my spine. Little did I know that we were about to embark on one of the most extraordinary adventures of our lives, one that would test the limits of Holmes' legendary intellect and challenge our very perceptions of truth and justice. The woman. The King of Bohemia leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper as he began his tale. 5 years ago, during a visit to Warsaw, I made the acquaintance of a woman unlike any I had ever met before. Her name was Irene Adler, an American opera singer of unparalleled beauty and wit. We became close, Mr. Holmes, closer than propriety would allow for a man of my station. Holmes nodded, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. And now this relationship threatens your impending nuptials, I presume? The king's eyes widened in surprise. How did you? Never mind, your reputation precedes you, Mr. Holmes. Yes, I am to be married to Clotilde Lothman von Saxe-Meiningen, a young Scandinavian princess. It is a match that will secure vital alliances for my kingdom. But Irene, she possesses a photograph, one that could destroy everything if it were to come to light. A compromising photograph, no doubt, Holmes mused. And Miss Adler has threatened to release it? Not in so many words, the king replied, wringing his hands. But she is a woman scorned, Mr. Holmes. Who knows what she might do? The photograph must be recovered at any cost. As Holmes peppered the king with questions, I found my mind wandering, conjuring images of this mysterious Irene Adler. What sort of woman could so thoroughly captivate a king and now hold him in such a state of fear? Little did I know that we would soon discover the answer to that question, and that it would shake the very foundations of Holmes' carefully constructed world of logic and reason. Very well, Your Majesty, Holmes said at last, rising to his feet. I shall take your case. But I must warn you, the path ahead may be fraught with danger and unexpected turns. Are you prepared to face whatever truths we may uncover? The king nodded solemnly. I am in your hands, Mr. Holmes. Whatever the cost, whatever the consequence, I must have that photograph. As our royal client took his leave, disappearing into the misty London night, Holmes turned to me with a gleam in his eye. Well, Watson, what do you make of it? I shook my head, still trying to process the extraordinary tale we had just heard. It seems a simple enough case of blackmail, Holmes. Surely a woman like this Irene Adler can be easily bought off? Holmes chuckled, a sound that always sent a thrill of excitement through me, for it meant that he had perceived something that had entirely escaped my notice. Oh, my dear Watson, he said, clapping me on the shoulder. I fear you underestimate our quarry. No, this is no simple case of blackmail. This, my friend, is the beginning of a game of wits, a battle of intellects the likes of which I have rarely encountered. And I, for one, can hardly wait to begin. As Holmes began to outline his plan, I felt that familiar surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. Once again, the game was afoot, and I knew that before long, we would be plunging headlong into another perilous adventure. But little did I know just how this case would challenge everything we thought we knew about human nature, love, and the thin line between right and wrong. The Great Disguise. The following morning dawned grey and drizzly, perfectly matching the mood of intrigue that had settled over Baker Street. I arrived to find Holmes already deep in preparation, surrounded by a veritable wardrobe of costumes and disguises. "Ah, Watson," he exclaimed upon seeing me. "Just in time. I shall need your assistance in transforming myself into a humble groom. We must observe Miss Adler's residence, and what better way than to blend in with the everyday life of her street?" For the next hour, I watched in amazement as Holmes meticulously crafted his disguise. Gone was the sharp-eyed detective, replaced by a slouching, gap-toothed stable hand with a pronounced limp. Even knowing it was him, I found myself hard-pressed to recognize my friend beneath the layers of grime and false hair. "Remember, Watson," Holmes said as we made our way to Bryony Lodge, Irene Adler's residence, we are not merely playing a dress-up. To truly disappear into a role, one must become the character entirely. Observe everything, no matter how trivial it may seem. The smallest detail could be the key to unraveling this entire mystery. As we took up our positions near Irene Adler's home, I marveled at Holmes' transformation. He chatted easily with the other grooms and stable hands, his Cockney accent flawless, his mannerisms so natural that even I began to doubt whether this was truly my friend or some stranger we had picked up along the way. For days, we maintained our vigil, watching the comings and goings at Briony Lodge. Holmes, in his guise as a groom, ingratiated himself with the household staff, gleaning bits of gossip and information that slowly began to paint a picture of the enigmatic Irene Adler. She's a rare one, that Miss Adler, an elderly maid, confided in Holmes one afternoon. Kind to us servants, she is, but with a fire in her eyes that'd make a wise man think twice before crossing her. Each night, as we returned to Baker Street, Holmes would pore over the information we had gathered, his agile mind connecting threads that were invisible to my own. But even as we delved deeper into the mystery, I sensed a change coming over my friend. There was a new light in his eyes when he spoke of Irene Adler, a note of admiration in his voice that I had rarely heard before. She is no ordinary woman, Watson, he mused one evening as we sat before the fire. Her intellect, her resourcefulness, in another life, she might have made a formidable detective herself. I raised an eyebrow at this uncharacteristic praise. I hope, Holmes, that you are not allowing your admiration for Miss Adler to cloud your judgment. Remember, we are here to retrieve that photograph, not to fall under her spell as the king did. Holmes waved away my concern with a laugh, but I noticed that his eyes didn't quite meet mine as he did so. Fear not, my dear Watson. My mind remains as clear and focused as ever. But tomorrow, we shall put our plan into action. And then we shall see just how formidable an opponent Irene Adler truly is. As I retired to my room that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the precipice of something momentous. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was indeed afoot. But I found myself wondering, not for the first time, whether we were the hunters in this scenario or the hunted. The cunning plan. The next evening found Holmes and me huddled in an alley across from Briony Lodge, the cool mist of a London night swirling around our ankles. Holmes, still in his grim disguise, was putting the final touches on an audacious plan that, he assured me, would gain us entry to Irene Adler's inner sanctum. Now, Watson, he whispered, his eyes glinting with excitement, when I give the signal, I need you to shout fire at the top of your lungs. Can you do that for me, old friend? I nodded, though I confess I felt a twinge of unease. But Holmes, surely such a deception. He cut me off with a wave of his hand. All's fair in love and war, my dear Watson. And make no mistake, this is most certainly war. Before I could protest further, Holmes darted out into the street, assuming the stumbling gait of his grim persona. As he passed beneath Irene Adler's window, he suddenly collapsed, clutching his chest and letting out a convincing groan of pain. Right on cue, a small crowd began to gather, murmuring in concern. And then, from an upstairs window, I heard a woman's voice, rich, melodious, and filled with genuine worry. "Oh, you poor man. Bring him inside, quickly." As two burly men lifted the injured Holmes and carried him into Briony Lodge, I steeled myself for my part in this charade. Taking a deep breath, I shouted, "Fire! Fire in the house!" The effect was instantaneous. People began pouring out of nearby buildings, and I saw curtains twitching in windows up and down the street. But my eyes were fixed on Bryony Lodge, where I knew Holmes was now inside, mere feet away from the object of our quest. For several long minutes, I waited in agony, my heart pounding in my chest. Had something gone wrong? Had Irene Adler seen through our ruse? And then, just as I was about to break cover and investigate, Holmes came stumbling out of the house, still maintaining his disguise. He gave me a nearly imperceptible nod as he passed, and I knew that he had succeeded in his mission. Later that night, back in the safety of Baker Street, Holmes recounted his adventure with barely contained glee. "Oh, Watson, you should have seen it. The photograph was hidden behind a sliding panel, exactly where I suspected it might be. And Irene Adler, she is even more remarkable in person than I had imagined." I couldn't help but notice the way Holmes' eyes lit up as he spoke of Miss Adler. "Holmes," I ventured cautiously, "you haven't, that is to say, you haven't allowed your feelings to." He waved away my concern with a laugh. "My dear Watson, you know me better than that. Sentiment is a chemical defect found in the losing side. No, I assure you, my interest in Miss Adler is purely professional. Tomorrow, we shall return to Bryony Lodge and retrieve the photograph, thus concluding this little adventure." As I retired to my room that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were not quite as simple as Holmes made them out to be. There was something in his voice, a note of what? Admiration? Respect? Or perhaps something deeper, something that even the great Sherlock Holmes himself had not yet recognized. Little did I know that the following day would bring a twist that would shake both Holmes and myself to our very cores, forever changing the way we viewed not only Irene Adler, but the very nature of love, loyalty, and the human heart. The tables turned. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a rarity in London that seemed to match Holmes' buoyant mood. As we made our way to Bryony Lodge, my friend practically bounced with each step, clearly relishing the imminent conclusion of our case. "You see, Watson," he explained as we walked, "Miss Adler will be out this morning, attending to some business in the city. We shall simply let ourselves in, retrieve the photograph, and be on our way. A tidy end to a most stimulating adventure." But as we rounded the corner onto Serpentine Avenue, we were met with a sight that stopped us both in our tracks. A carriage was pulled up in front of Bryony Lodge, and descending from it, resplendent in a traveling dress, was none other than Irene Adler herself. "Impossible," Holmes muttered, his brow furrowing. "She wasn't supposed to return until this afternoon." Before we could retreat, Irene's gaze fell upon us. For a moment, I feared we had been recognized. But then she smiled, a dazzling, knowing smile that sent a shiver down my spine, and swept past us into the house. Holmes stood frozen for a moment, an expression I had never seen before playing across his features. It was a mixture of surprise, admiration, and, was that a hint of fear? "Watson," he said slowly, "I believe we may have underestimated our opponent." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the door to Bryony Lodge flew open once more. But it wasn't Irene Adler who emerged. Instead, a young man in clerical garb came bounding down the steps, a look of unbridled joy on his face. She said yes. The veil lifted. The young clergyman's exclamation hung in the air, a joyous proclamation that seemed to shatter the very foundation of our carefully laid plans. Holmes and I exchanged a bewildered glance, both of us struggling to comprehend the sudden turn of events. Watson, Holmes whispered, his voice uncharacteristically strained. I fear we may have gravely miscalculated. Before I could respond, the door to Bryony Lodge opened once more, and out stepped Irene Adler herself. But gone was the carefully cultivated image of the opera diva we had come to expect. In its place stood a woman transformed by joy, her eyes sparkling with a light that seemed to outshine the morning sun. As we watched, frozen in place by shock and growing realization, Irene took the young clergyman's arm. They shared a look of such profound love and understanding that I felt my own heart constrict with a mixture of emotions I couldn't quite name. My dear Godfrey, Irene's melodious voice carried to where we stood. Let us waste no more time. To the church, and then to our new life together. With that, the pair climbed into the waiting carriage, which quickly disappeared down the street, leaving Holmes and me standing in stunned silence. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, slowly, a chuckle began to build in Holmes' chest. It grew and grew until he was laughing outright, a sound of genuine mirth that I had rarely heard from my friend. "Oh, Watson," he gasped between fits of laughter, "she has outplayed us all. The king, myself, everyone. Can you not see the brilliance of it?" I shook my head, still struggling to piece together the puzzle. "I'm afraid I don't follow, Holmes. What exactly has happened here?" Holmes clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes alight with a mixture of admiration and chagrin. "My dear fellow, we have just witnessed the conclusion of a game that began long before we ever set foot on this street. Miss Adler, or should I say Mrs. Norton, has not only secured her own happiness, but has also ensured her safety and freedom in one masterful stroke." As we made our way back to Baker Street, Holmes explained his deductions. Irene Adler, recognizing the precarious position she was in with the compromising photograph, had sought a way out that would satisfy all parties. In Godfrey Norton, a rising young lawyer of impeccable reputation, she had found not only love but also protection. By marrying Norton, Holmes mused, she has placed herself beyond the king's reach. No scandal can touch a respectable married woman, and the photograph, should it ever come to light, would be seen as nothing more than a youthful indiscretion on the king's part. I marveled at the intricacy of the plan. But Holmes, surely she couldn't have known we were coming. How did she manage to orchestrate all this so perfectly? A wry smile played across my friend's lips. "Ah, Watson, therein lies the true genius of Irene Adler. She didn't need to know we were coming. She simply prepared for every eventuality. Our presence here merely accelerated a plan already in motion." As we entered our rooms at Baker Street, a small envelope on the mantelpiece caught my eye. Holmes, following my gaze, snatched it up with uncharacteristic eagerness. As he read the note inside, I saw a range of emotions flicker across his face: surprise, respect, and something else I couldn't quite identify. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, curiosity getting the better of me. He handed me the note with a rueful shake of his head. "It seems, my dear Watson, that we have been bested at our own game." The note, written in a flowing, elegant hand, read, "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, Asterisk, you played your part to perfection, but perhaps not in the way you intended. Your disguise as a groom was masterful, but did you truly believe you could fool a woman who has spent her life on the stage? Your appearance at Bryony Lodge merely confirmed what I had long suspected, that the king had sought your aid, Asterisk. Asterisk, rest assured, the photograph you seek is quite safe. It shall serve as my protection should it ever be needed, but I have no intention of using it to harm His Majesty. My heart now belongs to another, and with this new chapter of my life, I close the book on old entanglements, asterisk. Asterisk, I leave you with a token of my esteem, a photograph of my own. Not the one you sought, but perhaps one you might value more. For you have taught me, Mr. Holmes, that even the most rational of minds can be touched by sentiment, asterisk. Yours, in admiration and gratitude, Irene Norton, née Adler. As I finished reading, I looked up to see Holmes carefully removing a small photograph from the envelope. It showed Irene Adler, no, Irene Norton, gazing directly at the camera with a mixture of intelligence, mischief, and warmth that seemed to leap from the image. "Well, Watson," Holmes said softly, his eyes never leaving the photograph, "what do you make of that?" I studied my friend's face, noting the complex play of emotions there. "I think, Holmes, that we have encountered a rare individual indeed. One who has managed to challenge not only your intellect, but perhaps even your view of the fairer sex." Holmes nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Indeed, Watson. Indeed." He carefully placed the photograph in his desk drawer, then turned to me with a glint in his eye. "And now, my friend, I believe it's time we informed His Majesty of the interesting conclusion to his case." As we set out once more into the bustling streets of London, I couldn't help but feel that we had been part of something truly extraordinary. The case of Irene Adler, now Norton, had tested Holmes in ways I had never seen before, and I suspected that the memory of this remarkable woman would stay with him for years to come. Little did I know that this adventure was just the beginning, the first of many encounters that would challenge our perceptions, test our resolve, and ultimately reveal the complex tapestry of human nature in all its brilliant, unpredictable glory. Echoes of Adler. In the days that followed our encounter with Irene Adler, I noticed a subtle change in Sherlock Holmes. While he threw himself into new cases with his usual fervor, there were moments when I would catch him staring off into space, a faraway look in his eyes that I had never seen before. One evening, as we sat before the fire in our Baker Street rooms, I decided to broach the subject. "Holmes," I began cautiously, "I can't help but notice that the Adler case seems to have affected you rather deeply." He raised an eyebrow, his keen gaze fixing upon me. "What makes you say that, Watson?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Well, it's just that you seem different. More contemplative, perhaps. And I've noticed you looking at her photograph more than once. For a moment, I feared I had overstepped." But then Holmes let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head ruefully. "Ah, Watson, your powers of observation continue to improve. You are correct, of course. The case of Irene Adler, Irene Norton, I should say, has indeed left its mark upon me." He rose from his chair, pacing the room with restless energy. "You see, my dear friend, I have always prided myself on my ability to remain detached, to view the world through the cold lens of logic and reason. But Irene, she challenged that worldview in ways I had not anticipated." I leaned forward, intrigued. It was rare for Holmes to open up like this, and I was determined to make the most of it. "How so?" Holmes paused by the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded streets of London. "She showed me that emotion and intellect need not be mutually exclusive. That one can be both brilliant and passionate, logical and loving. It's a revelation that I'm still grappling with, if I'm honest." As he spoke, I couldn't help but marvel at the profound impact this woman had had on my friend. Sherlock Holmes, the man who had once dismissed love as a chemical defect found in the losing side, was now wrestling with the very concepts he had so long disdained. But surely, I ventured, this new perspective can only enhance your abilities as a detective? A deeper understanding of human nature, of the interplay between heart and mind, could prove invaluable in your work. Holmes turned to me, a slow smile spreading across his face. Once again, Watson, you have hit upon the crux of the matter. Indeed, I find myself approaching our cases with a new lens, one that takes into account not just the cold facts, but the warm complexities of human emotion. He returned to his chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin in that familiar pose of contemplation. Take our current case, for instance. The mystery of the vanishing heirloom might seem, on the surface, to be a simple matter of theft. But when we consider the emotional attachments involved, the family dynamics at play, well, it opens up a whole new realm of possibilities, doesn't it? I nodded, beginning to see the case in a new light myself. I suppose it does at that, Holmes. I suppose it does. As the night wore on and we delved deeper into the intricacies of our latest mystery, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. The world's greatest detective had been changed by his encounter with Irene Adler, and I had a feeling that our future adventures would be all the richer for it. The Crimson Thread. Little did I know that the echoes of Irene Adler would continue to reverberate through our lives, leading us down paths we never could have anticipated and testing the limits of Holmes' newfound emotional awareness in ways that would shake us both to our very cores. It was a crisp autumn morning when the case that would come to be known as the adventure of the Crimson Thread began. I had just settled into my chair with the morning paper when Holmes burst into our sitting room, his eyes alight with excitement. "Watson," he exclaimed, waving a telegram in his hand. "Pack your bags, old friend. We're off to Dartmoor on the first train." I lowered my paper, eyeing him curiously. "Dartmoor? What's drawn us there, Holmes?" He paced the room, his energy palpable. "A most peculiar case, Watson. Lady Elisabetta Blackwood has requested our immediate assistance. It seems her husband, Sir Charles Blackwood, has vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a single crimson thread and a cryptic note." As we boarded the train to Dartmoor, Holmes filled me in on the details. The Blackwoods were a respected family, known for their vast estate and Sir Charles's groundbreaking work in botanical research. Lady Elisabetta had awoken 3 days prior to find her husband gone, his study in disarray, and a note that read simply, "The Crimson Thread unravels all." But what makes this case so special, Holmes? I asked, knowing there must be more to draw my friend's interest so keenly. A shadow passed over Holmes' face. "The lady's maiden name, Watson. She was born Elisabetta Norton." I felt a jolt of recognition. Norton? Surely not related to Godfrey Norton, Holmes finished. Irene Adler's husband. Lady Elisabetta is his younger sister. The pieces began to fall into place. "So you think there might be a connection to our previous encounter with Mrs. Norton?" Holmes shook his head, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I'm not sure, Watson, but I can't shake the feeling that there's more to this disappearance than meets the eye. And if Irene is involved, even tangentially, well, we must be prepared for anything." As our train wound its way through the misty countryside, I couldn't help but notice a change in Holmes. There was an intensity in his gaze, a tension in his posture that spoke of more than just professional interest. The mere possibility of Irene Adler's involvement seemed to have awakened something in him, a complex mixture of anticipation and, was it trepidation? We arrived at Blackwood Manor as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the imposing Gothic structure. Lady Elisabetta greeted us at the door, her pale face etched with worry. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Thank you for coming so quickly. I didn't know who else to turn to." As we followed her into the house, I saw Holmes studying her intently. Lady Elisabetta was a striking woman with the same sharp intelligence in her eyes that I remembered from Irene Adler. But where Irene had exuded confidence and mischief, Lady Elisabetta seemed weighted down by fear and uncertainty. "Please, my lady," Holmes said gently, "tell us everything. Leave out no detail, no matter how insignificant it may seem." Over the next hour, Lady Elisabetta recounted the events leading up to her husband's disappearance. Sir Charles had been working late in his study, as was his habit. She had gone to bed only to be awakened in the middle of the night by a strange sound, a sort of rhythmic tapping, she said, like raindrops on a window pane. But when I went to investigate, she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper, the sound stopped. And Charles was gone. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. "And the crimson thread? Where did you find it?" Lady Elisabetta reached into her pocket and produced a small envelope. Inside was a single thread of the most vibrant red I had ever seen. Holmes examined it closely, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Most curious," he murmured. "Watson, what do you make of this?" I took the thread, turning it over in my fingers. "It's silk, I believe. Quite fine quality. But beyond that..." Holmes nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Indeed, Watson. But notice the peculiar sheen? This is no ordinary silk. I believe we're dealing with something far more exotic and potentially dangerous." As night fell over Blackwood Manor, Holmes insisted on examining Sir Charles's study. The room was a testament to organized chaos, shelves overflowing with books and scientific journals, tables laden with botanical specimens, and in the center, a massive desk covered in papers and strange-looking instruments. "Look here, Watson," Holmes called, pointing to a series of scratches on the hardwood floor. "What do you see?" I knelt down, squinting in the dim lamplight. "They look like claw marks, but surely no ordinary animal could have." My words were cut short by a blood-curdling scream from somewhere deep within the house. Holmes and I exchanged a quick glance before racing towards the sound, our hearts pounding in our chests. As we rounded a corner, we came face to face with a sight that would haunt my dreams for years to come. There, at the end of the hallway, stood a figure that seemed to defy all logic and reason. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but its body appeared to be composed entirely of writhing, crimson threads. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then the creature turned its featureless head towards us, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized we were facing something far beyond our understanding. Holmes, however, showed no fear. He stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed the impossible being before us. "Who are you? What have you done with Sir Charles Blackwood?" The creature made no sound, but the threads that composed its body began to shift and ripple. Suddenly, words appeared on its surface, formed by the moving strands. The crimson thread unravels all. And with that cryptic message, the being dissolved into a shower of red silk, leaving Holmes and me standing in stunned silence. As we turned to each other, both of us struggling to process what we had just witnessed, I saw something in Holmes' eyes that I had never seen before, a mixture of fear and exhilaration that spoke of the unknown territories we were about to explore. "Well, Watson," he said softly, a wry smile tugging at his lips, "it seems our adventure has taken a rather unexpected turn. Are you ready to unravel this crimson mystery?" I nodded, my own pulse quickening with anticipation. "Always, Holmes. Always." Little did we know that this was just the beginning of a case that would challenge not only our intellects, but our very understanding of reality itself. The game was afoot, and the stakes had never been higher. Threads of deception. The following morning found Holmes and me huddled in Sir Charles's study, poring over his notes and journals. The events of the previous night hung heavy in the air, an unspoken tension coloring our every interaction. "I must admit, Watson," Holmes said, breaking the silence, "I find myself at something of a loss. In all my years as a detective, I have never encountered anything quite like this creature." I nodded, still struggling to reconcile what we had seen with my understanding of the world. "Do you think it could have been some sort of hallucination? A trick of the light, perhaps?" Holmes shook his head, his brow furrowed in concentration. "No, my friend. Whatever we saw was quite real, I'm certain of it. The question is, what is its connection to Sir Charles's disappearance? And more importantly, how does it relate to our crimson thread?" As if in answer to his question, a gust of wind blew through the open window, scattering papers across the desk. One particular document caught Holmes' eye, and he snatched it up with an exclamation of triumph. "Look here, Watson." Sir Charles's last journal entry, dated the very night of his disappearance. I leaned in, squinting at the hasty scrawl. Asterisk breakthrough at last. The crimson orchid yields its secrets. But at what cost? The threads between worlds grow thin. Must contact Dee. She will know what to do. God help us all if asterisk. The entry ended abruptly, a long ink streak marring the page as if Sir Charles had been interrupted mid-sentence. "The crimson orchid," Holmes mused, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Now that is interesting indeed." Before I could inquire further, there was a soft knock at the study door. Lady Elizabeth entered, looking pale and drawn. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to show you." She led us to a hidden door in the library, revealing a steep staircase that descended into darkness. As we followed her down, the air grew thick and humid, filled with the heady scent of exotic flowers. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a vast underground greenhouse. Rows upon rows of plants stretched out before us, many of which I had never seen before. But it was the structure at the center of the room that drew our attention. A large, ornate cage stood on a raised platform, its bars made of what appeared to be the same crimson threads we had encountered the night before. And inside... Good God, I breathed, taking an involuntary step back. The plant within the cage was like nothing I had ever seen. Its petals were the deep red of fresh blood, shot through with veins of gold. But more disturbing were the tendrils that seemed to reach out from the flower, writhing and twisting in the air as if alive. "The crimson orchid," Lady Elizabeth said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "Charles's life's work. He believed it held the key to something beyond our world." Holmes approached the cage cautiously, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "And this Ian mentioned in his journal. Who might that be?" Lady Elizabeth hesitated, a flicker of something, guilt, fear passing across her face. I believe he meant my sister-in-law, Irene." The name hung in the air between us, laden with unspoken implications. Holmes' face remained impassive, but I saw his hands clench slightly at his sides. "I see," he said softly. "And do you know how to contact her?" Lady Elizabeth shook her head. "No, I'm afraid not. Irene has always been elusive. But if anyone could find her, Mr. Holmes, I believe it would be you." As we made our way back upstairs, my mind was reeling with questions. What was the true nature of this crimson orchid? How was it connected to the thread-like being we had encountered? And most pressingly, what role did Irene Adler play in all of this? Holmes was uncharacteristically quiet as we returned to the study, his brow furrowed in deep thought. Finally, he turned to me, a determined glint in his eye. "Watson," he said, "I believe it's time we widened the scope of our investigation. Pack your bags, old friend. We're going to Paris." "Paris?" I echoed, confused. But what about the investigation here? What about Sir Charles? Holmes smiled, a hint of his old mischief returning to his face. "My dear Watson, don't you see? The game is no longer confined to Dartmoor. No, I fear we're dealing with something far larger and far more dangerous than we initially believed." As we prepared for our journey, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the precipice of something monumental. The crimson orchid, the mysterious thread being Irene Adler, all threads in a tapestry we had only just begun to unravel. Little did I know that our adventure in Paris would not only challenge our understanding of the case, but would also force Holmes to confront his own deepest fears and desires. The echoes of Irene Adler were about to become a resounding chorus, and none of us would emerge unchanged. Shadows of Paris. The journey to Paris was a quiet one, with Holmes lost in thought and I struggling to piece together the disparate threads of our increasingly complex case. As our train wound its way through the French countryside, I couldn't help but wonder what awaited us in the City of Light. We arrived in Paris as evening was falling, the streets aglow with the warm light of gas lamps. Holmes led us to a small, nondescript hotel in the Montmartre district, far from the glittering boulevards and fashionable cafes. "We must tread carefully, Watson," he said as we settled into our room. "If Irene Adler is indeed in Paris, she will not be easy to find. And I fear we may not be the only ones looking for her." The next morning found us wandering the winding streets of Montmartre, Holmes' sharp eyes taking in every detail. We visited cafes, art galleries, and small theaters, always asking the same question: had anyone seen a woman matching Irene Adler's description? It wasn't until late afternoon that we got our first break. A street artist, setting up his easel near the Sacre-Cœur, overheard our inquiries. "La femme mystérieuse," he said, his eyes lighting up with recognition. I have seen her. She comes to the Café des Artistes every evening at sunset. A true muse, that one. Holmes thanked the man, slipping him a few francs for his trouble. As we made our way to the cafe, I could sense a change in my friend's demeanor. There was a tension in his shoulders, a tightness around his eyes that spoke of more than just professional interest. "Holmes," I ventured, "are you quite all right?" He glanced at me, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Perfectly fine, Watson. Just preparing myself for what promises to be a most interesting encounter." The Café des Artistes was a small, dimly lit establishment tucked away on a quiet side street. As we entered, the rich aroma of coffee and the soft strains of a violin filled the air. And there, at a table in the corner, sat a woman who could only be Irene Adler. She looked up as we approached, a smile of recognition lighting up her face. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, her voice as melodious as I remembered. "I wondered how long it would take you to find me." Holmes inclined his head slightly, his face an inscrutable mask. "Mrs. Norton. Or do you prefer Adler these days?" Irene laughed, a sound like silver bells. "Oh, let's dispense with formalities, shall we? Please, sit. I have a feeling we have much to discuss." As we took our seats, I couldn't help but marvel at the energy crackling between Holmes and Irene. It was like watching two master fencers circling each other, each searching for an opening. "I assume," Irene said, sipping her coffee, "that you're here about Charles Blackwood and his unusual botanical discovery?" Holmes leaned forward, his eyes never leaving Irene's face. "Indeed. It seems you're rather well informed, Miss Adler." She smiled enigmatically. "I make it my business to stay informed, Mr. Holmes, especially when it concerns matters of, shall we say, an otherworldly nature." I felt a chill run down my spine at her words. "Otherworldly? Surely you don't mean to suggest that there are things in this world beyond our current understanding?" Irene finished, her gaze shifting to me. "Oh, Dr. Watson, you've seen The Creature of Crimson Threads. Surely you don't still cling to the notion that science can explain everything?" Holmes cleared his throat, drawing Irene's attention back to him. "The Crimson Orchid," he said softly. "What do you know about it?" For a moment, Irene's carefully composed facade slipped, and I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. "It's dangerous, Sherlock. More dangerous than you can possibly imagine. Charles, he didn't understand what he was dealing with. None of us did. And now?" Holmes pressed. Irene sighed, suddenly looking weary. "Now, I fear we may have set something in motion that we cannot control. The barriers between worlds are thinning, Sherlock. And what lies on the other side, it hungers." As she spoke, I noticed a strange shimmer in the air around us. The sounds of the cafe seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie, rhythmic tapping like raindrops on a windowpane. Holmes must have noticed it too, for he suddenly tensed, his hand reaching for mine under the table. "Irene," he said urgently, "we need to leave. Now." But it was too late. As we rose from our seats, the air itself seemed to tear open, revealing a swirling vortex of crimson threads. And from within that impossible breach stepped a figure that defied all logic and reason. It was the thread being we had encountered at Blackwood Manor, but now it seemed more solid, more real. Its featureless head turned towards us, and though it had no eyes, I felt the weight of its gaze upon us. "The crimson thread unravels all," it said, its voice a discordant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Irene was on her feet in an instant, her hand reaching into her purse to produce a small, intricately carved box. "Sherlock, Watson," she said, her voice tight with tension. "Whatever happens, stay close to me." As the thread being advanced, Irene opened the box. A blinding light erupted from within, and I felt a sensation like being pulled in 1,000 directions at once. The cafe dissolved around us, replaced by a swirling maelstrom of colors and shapes. The last thing I heard before consciousness slipped away was Holmes' voice, tight with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. "My dear Watson, I believe our adventure has taken a turn into the truly extraordinary." And then darkness claimed me, leaving me to wonder what strange new world we would find ourselves in when we awoke. Realms beyond. I came to consciousness slowly, my head pounding and my senses reeling. As I blinked away the fog of disorientation, I found myself lying on a soft, spongy surface that pulsed with an otherworldly bioluminescence. The air around us was thick and humid, filled with the scent of alien flora. "Watson, are you all right?" Holmes' voice cut through my confusion, and I felt his hand on my shoulder, helping me to sit up. I think so," I managed, taking in our surroundings with growing amazement. "Good God, Holmes. Where are we?" We were in what appeared to be a vast jungle, but unlike any I had ever seen or imagined. The trees towered hundreds of feet into the air, their trunks spiraling in impossible geometric patterns. Flowers of every conceivable color and shape dotted the landscape, many of them moving of their own accord. And weaving through it all were strands of that now familiar crimson thread, pulsing with an inner light. "I believe, my dear Watson," Holmes said, his voice tight with a mixture of fear and excitement, "that we have stepped into a realm beyond our own. The question is, how do we get back?" "We don't," came Irene's voice from behind us. She was standing a few feet away, the strange box still clutched in her hands. "Not until we've done what we came here to do." Holmes turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "And what exactly is that, Miss Adler? What game are you playing?" Irene's face softened, and for a moment I saw genuine vulnerability in her eyes. "This is no game, Sherlock. This is about saving not just our world, but all worlds. The crimson orchid, it's not just a flower. It's a key to the spaces between realms." As she spoke, I noticed movement in the underbrush around us. Strange, shadowy creatures flitted between the trees, their forms constantly shifting and changing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized we were being watched. "Charles discovered it by accident," Irene continued, her voice low and urgent. "He didn't understand the power he was dealing with. But there are others who do. Others who would use the orchid to break down the barriers between worlds completely." Holmes was silent for a long moment, his keen gaze taking in every detail of our alien surroundings. Finally, he spoke. "The thread being. It's a guardian of some sort, isn't it? Trying to prevent the barriers from collapsing?" Irene nodded, a grim smile on her face. "Very good, Sherlock. Yes, the Crimson Sentinel, as Charles called it, is trying to maintain the balance. But it's fighting a losing battle. That's why we're here. We need to find the source of the threads and seal the breach before it's too late. As if in response to her words, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the jungle. The ground beneath our feet began to tremble, and in the distance, I saw what looked like a mountain begin to move. "Oh my," Holmes breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. "Watson, are you seeing this?" The mountain was rising, revealing itself to be a colossal creature unlike anything I had ever seen. Its body was a writhing mass of crimson threads, constantly shifting and reforming. As it turned towards us, I saw that its face was a swirling vortex reminiscent of the portal that had brought us to this strange realm. "The heart of threads," Irene whispered, her voice filled with awe. "The source of all connections between worlds. We need to reach it." Holmes turned to her, his face set with determination. "Lead the way, Miss Adler. It seems we have a universe to save." As we set off through the alien jungle, I couldn't help but marvel at the turn our adventure had taken. We had stepped beyond the bounds of our known world into a realm of wonder and danger beyond imagining. And at the center of it all was Irene Adler, a woman who continued to surprise and challenge us at every turn. I glanced at Holmes, noting the mix of emotions playing across his face. Excitement, fear, and something else, something I had rarely seen in my friend. A deep, abiding respect and perhaps even affection for the remarkable woman leading us into the unknown. As we pressed on, the jungle grew denser, the crimson threads more numerous. Strange creatures chittered and called from the shadows, their forms just beyond the edge of comprehension. And always, the massive form of the heart of threads loomed before us, drawing us inexorably towards our destiny. Little did we know that the true test of our courage, intellect, and the bonds between us was yet to come. For in the heart of this alien realm, we would face challenges that would push us to our very limits, forcing us to confront not just external threats, but the deepest, most hidden parts of ourselves. The fate of multiple worlds hung in the balance, and we were the only ones who could tip the scales. The game, as Holmes would say, was well and truly afoot. The Crimson Labyrinth. As we ventured deeper into the alien jungle, the landscape began to shift around us. The towering trees gave way to massive, undulating structures that seemed to be composed entirely of the crimson threads we had seen earlier. It was as if we had entered the circulatory system of some impossibly vast organism. "Fascinating," Holmes murmured, his keen eyes taking in every detail. "It appears that these threads are not merely connecting different realms, but actively shaping the environment around us." Irene nodded, her face a mask of concentration as she led us forward. The threads respond to thought and emotion. The stronger the feeling, the more dramatic the effect on our surroundings. We must be cautious, our very minds could betray us here. As if to underscore her point, the pathway ahead of us suddenly split into a complex maze of intersecting corridors. I felt a wave of disorientation wash over me, and the walls of the labyrinth seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat. "Stay calm, Watson," Holmes said, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. "Focus your mind. We must not allow this place to overwhelm us." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to concentrate on the task at hand. As my panic subsided, I noticed that the labyrinth seemed to stabilize, the pulsing of the walls slowing to a gentle rhythm. Irene turned to us, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. "The heart of threads lies at the center of this maze. But be warned, we are not the only ones seeking it. The forces that would tear down the barriers between worlds have agents here, and they will stop at nothing to reach their goal. As we made our way through the twisting corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to flit just at the edge of my vision, and strange, discordant whispers echoed through the air. Suddenly, Holmes held up a hand, signaling us to stop. "Listen," he whispered. "Do you hear that?" At first, I heard nothing but the ambient hum of the crimson threads. But then, faintly, I caught the sound of footsteps approaching from multiple directions. "We're surrounded," Irene hissed, her hand going to the strange box she carried. Before we could formulate a plan, figures emerged from the shadows around us. They were humanoid in shape, but their bodies seemed to be composed of swirling darkness, punctuated by pinpricks of light like distant stars. "The Void Walkers," Irene breathed, her voice tight with fear. "Servants of those who would unmake reality itself." The creatures advanced, their movements fluid and unnaturally graceful. I reached for my revolver, only to remember with a sinking feeling that it had been left behind in our own world. Holmes, however, seemed remarkably calm. "Watson, Miss Adler," he said quietly, "I believe it's time we put your theory about the power of thought in this realm to the test. Concentrate. Imagine the threads responding to our will." I closed my eyes, focusing all my mental energy on the crimson threads surrounding us. I pictured them moving, weaving together to form a barrier between us and the approaching Void Walkers. When I opened my eyes, I gasped in amazement. A shimmering wall of crimson energy had indeed materialized around us, holding the shadowy figures at bay. "Remarkable," Holmes said, a note of genuine wonder in his voice. "It seems, my dear Watson, that in this world, the power of the mind is quite literal." Irene was already moving, her hands weaving complex patterns in the air. The crimson threads responded to her movements, forming a tunnel through the ranks of our otherworldly assailants. "Quickly," she called. "I can't hold this for long." We dashed through the opening, the angry hisses of the Void Walkers echoing behind us. As we ran, the labyrinth shifted and changed around us, responding to our desperate flight. Corridors merged and split, staircases appeared and disappeared, and all the while, the crimson threads pulsed with an ever-increasing urgency. Finally, we burst into a vast, spherical chamber. At its center floated an enormous, pulsating orb of crimson energy, the heart of threads itself. "We've made it," Irene said, breathless. But now comes the truly difficult part. As we approached the heart, I felt a strange sensation wash over me. It was as if every thought, every memory, every emotion I had ever experienced was being gently probed and examined. Holmes stumbled, his face contorted in a mixture of awe and discomfort. "Good God," he whispered. "It's conscious. The heart, it's aware of us." Irene nodded grimly. "The heart of threads is the nexus of all realities. It knows everything that has been, everything that is, and everything that could be. And now it will judge us." As if in response to her words, tendrils of crimson energy reached out from the heart, enveloping each of us in a cocoon of shimmering light. I felt my consciousness expanding, touching minds and realities far beyond my own. In that moment, I understood the true scope of our mission. The fate of not just our world, but countless others hung in the balance. And the key to saving them all lay within us, within our memories, our experiences, and the bonds we shared. As the heart of threads probed deeper into our minds, I realized that our greatest challenge was yet to come. For in order to save reality itself, we would have to confront our deepest fears, our most closely guarded secrets, and the truths we had been hiding even from ourselves. The true nature of Holmes' feelings for Irene, the hidden depths of Irene's own past, and the unspoken doubts and insecurities that had plagued me throughout our adventures, all would be laid bare before the cosmic consciousness of the heart. And in that crucible of absolute truth, the fate of all existence would be decided. Truths unveiled. The crimson light of the heart of threads pulsed around us, its rhythm syncing with our heartbeats. I felt as though I was everywhere and nowhere at once. My consciousness expanded beyond the limits of my physical form. Through this cosmic awareness, I could sense Holmes and Irene beside me, their minds also grappling with this overwhelming experience. Suddenly, scenes from our past began to play out before us, projected onto the very fabric of reality by the heart's power. I saw our first meeting at St. Bart's, the many cases we had solved together, the moments of triumph and the narrow escapes. But more than that, I saw the unspoken emotions, the quiet moments of companionship that had forged our friendship into something unbreakable. Holmes gasped beside me, his usual composure shattered by the weight of the revelations. I saw him as a young boy, brilliant but isolated, seeking solace in the cold comfort of logic and deduction. I felt his struggle against the turbulent emotions he had spent a lifetime suppressing, and his growing realization that true strength lay not in detachment, but in connection. And then there was Irene. Her past unfolded before us like the pages of a book, a young woman of extraordinary talent and ambition, forced to navigate a world that sought to constrain her. I saw her use her wit and charm as both weapon and shield, always staying one step ahead of those who would control her. But beneath the carefully crafted persona of the cunning adventuress, I glimpsed a longing for genuine connection, for someone who could see and appreciate her true self. As these visions swirled around us, I began to understand the true nature of the threat we faced. The Void Walkers and their masters sought to break down the barriers between realities not out of malice, but out of a misguided belief that by merging all possible worlds, they could create a perfect existence. They didn't realize that it was the very diversity of realities, the infinite potential of what might be, that gave meaning to existence itself. The heart of threads pulsed once more, and I felt a question form in my mind, not in words, but in pure concept. It was asking us why our reality, our version of existence, deserved to be preserved. Holmes was the first to respond, his thoughts resonating through the crimson light. It is the uncertainty, the mystery of our world that gives it value, he projected. A realm of infinite knowledge and predetermined outcomes would be stagnant, devoid of the challenge and growth that gives life its purpose. Irene's consciousness brushed against ours, her thoughts tinged with a bittersweet understanding. Our world is flawed, often cruel, but it is in overcoming those flaws that we find our strength. It is the struggle that forges connections, that allows us to transcend our limitations and become more than we ever thought possible. As for me, I found myself thinking of the countless patients I had treated, the lives touched and changed through simple acts of kindness and compassion. It is our capacity for empathy, for reaching out to others even in the darkest of times, that makes our world worth preserving, I offered. The potential for goodness, for love, exists in every reality, waiting to be nurtured and grown. The heart of threads pulsed once more, and I felt a sense of approval, acceptance. It was hard to put into words, but I knew that we had passed some cosmic test. Slowly, gently, the crimson light began to recede, returning us to our physical forms. As my expanded consciousness settled back into the confines of my body, I felt both a sense of loss and a profound gratitude for the experience. Holmes, Irene, and I found ourselves standing before the heart of threads once more, but everything had changed. The air around us shimmered with possibility, and I could sense the delicate balance of reality stabilizing. Irene was the first to break the silence, her voice hushed with awe. "It's done. The breach is sealed, the balance restored." Holmes nodded, his eyes still wide with wonder. "Indeed. But I suspect the effects of this adventure will resonate far beyond this moment." As if in response to his words, the chamber around us began to shift and dissolve. The crimson threads wove themselves into a portal, a shimmering doorway that I somehow knew would return us to our own world. Before we stepped through, Holmes turned to Irene, his expression softer than I had ever seen it. "Miss Adler," he began, then paused, correcting himself. "Irene, I believe we have much to discuss when we return." Irene smiled, a genuine warmth replacing her usual enigmatic expression. "Indeed we do, Sherlock. Indeed we do." As we stepped through the portal, leaving the realm of the heart of threads behind, I couldn't help but feel that this was not an end, but a new beginning. We had faced the ultimate mystery, confronted truths about ourselves and the nature of reality itself, and emerged transformed. Whatever challenges awaited us back in our own world, I knew that we would face them with a new understanding, a deeper appreciation for the bonds between us, and the knowledge that even in the darkest of times, the power to shape our destiny lay within our own hearts and minds. The game, as Holmes would say, was afoot once more. But this time, we were playing for stakes higher than we had ever imagined, armed with truths that would change us and our world forever. Echoes of the Crimson Thread. As we materialized back in the familiar confines of 221 Baker Street, the weight of our otherworldly adventure settled upon us like a heavy cloak. The cozy sitting room, with its cluttered surfaces and lingering scent of tobacco, seemed almost surreal after the cosmic vastness we had experienced. Holmes was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of wonder. "Well, my friends, it appears we have returned. Though I confess, I feel as though we have been irreversibly changed by our journey." Irene nodded, sinking gracefully into an armchair. "Indeed, Sherlock. One does not peer into the heart of all realities and emerge unscathed." Her eyes, usually twinkling with mischief, now held a depth of understanding that spoke volumes of our shared experience. I moved to the sideboard, pouring us each a generous measure of brandy. My hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. "I fear it may take some time to fully process all that we have seen and learned," I said, passing the glasses around. Holmes accepted his drink with a nod of thanks. "Quite right, Watson. But we must also consider the immediate consequences of our actions. We may have sealed the breach and restored balance to the multiverse, but I suspect our adventure is far from over." Irene leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. "The Voidwalkers and their masters won't simply give up their plans. They may seek other ways to break down the barriers between worlds." "And what of Sir Charles Blackwood?" I asked, suddenly remembering the catalyst for our extraordinary journey. "Is he truly lost to us?" A shadow passed over Irene's face. "I fear that Charles may have become entangled in the threads between worlds. His physical form may be beyond our reach, but his consciousness, that may be another matter entirely." Holmes paced the room, his keen mind clearly racing with possibilities. Then our task is twofold. We must remain vigilant against further incursions from other realities, while also seeking a way to bring Sir Charles home, or at least to understand his fate. As he spoke, I noticed a faint shimmer in the air near the fireplace. At first, I thought it a trick of the light, but as I watched, the shimmer coalesced into a familiar form, the crimson thread being we had encountered at the beginning of our adventure. By Jove, I breathed, my hand instinctively reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Holmes and Irene turned, their expressions a mixture of surprise and wary curiosity. The being made no aggressive moves, instead seeming to study us with its featureless face. "The Crimson Sentinel," Irene said softly. "But why has it followed us here?" As if in response to her question, the being's form rippled and words appeared on its surface. "Guardians chosen. Balance maintained. But danger lingers." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes alight with that familiar spark of intellectual curiosity. "Are you saying that our role in maintaining the balance between worlds is not yet complete?" The being's form shifted again. "Threads connect all. You are now part of the tapestry. When needed, you will be called." With that cryptic message, the Crimson Sentinel dissolved into a shower of glittering threads, which quickly faded from view. Silence reigned for a moment as we absorbed the implications of this development. Finally, Holmes turned to us, a wry smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Well, my dear Watson, Miss Adler, it seems our lives have become considerably more interesting. We are no longer merely detectives and adventurers, but guardians of the very fabric of reality itself." Irene raised her glass in a toast. "To new beginnings, gentlemen, and to mysteries beyond imagining." As we clinked our glasses together, I couldn't help but feel a thrill of excitement mixed with trepidation. Our understanding of the world, of all worlds, had been fundamentally altered. The games of shadows and secrets we had played in the streets of London now extended to the very cosmos itself. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever dark forces might seek to unravel the delicate balance we had helped restore, I knew that together, the world's only consulting detective, the woman who had bested him, and the faithful chronicler of their adventures, we would face them head-on. The threads of fate had brought us together, weaving a tapestry of friendship, love, and cosmic mystery. And as the fire crackled in the hearth of 221 Baker Street, I realized that our greatest adventure was only just beginning. As the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows through the foggy streets of London, Sherlock Holmes stood at the window of 221 Baker Street, his keen eyes lost in thought. The photograph of Irene Adler rested on the table beside him, a small but undeniable symbol of the one woman who had ever truly challenged him. He turned suddenly, his voice calm but laden with something Watson could not quite place. "Watson," he began, his words measured, "I fear that this is far from over." Before Watson could ask what Holmes meant, there was a sharp knock at the door. Mrs. Hudson rushed in, breathless, holding a telegram in her trembling hands. "For you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice filled with nervous anticipation. Holmes opened the envelope with a flick of his wrist, scanning the message quickly. His face, normally so composed, showed a flicker of surprise before he handed the note to Watson. The message was simple, yet chilling in its brevity. "The game is not yet finished." Aye. Watson felt a shiver run down his spine. Irene Adler, the woman they thought had vanished into the shadows of their past, had returned. But for what purpose? What new game was she about to play? Holmes turned back to the window, the distant look of excitement already dancing in his eyes. "It seems, Watson," he said softly, "that the next move is hers. And I, for one, am eager to see how this ends." With that, Holmes smiled, calm, confident, and ready for whatever came next. The game was afoot once more, and neither he nor Watson could predict just how far it would take them.